I didn't even really want to preach on this sermon. I just wanted to show the movie. I was like, how much time do we have? Can we reserve the sanctuary for 2 extra hours today? How many folks here actually saw the movie American Fiction? Some folks, good. I guess not everybody loved it. Hopefully enough of you loved it. If you haven't seen it yet, I highly, highly recommend it. It's amazing. It won an Oscar for, I think it was Best Screenplay, Adapted Screenplay. And it was possibly the best thing that Jeffrey Wright has done yet, which is really saying something. He's the main character. So if you can't tell yet from the trailer, so Jeffrey Wright plays a highly educated black author and college professor whose carefully crafted novels don't hardly sell anything. No one wants to read that. What they want to read is these kind of quick reads with really uncomplicated, stereotypical kind of characters. And at a book convention, he meets Sinatra Golden, who's played by the always hilarious Issa Rae, and sees that she's become very loved and is selling out all these auditoriums, giving all these talks. And she's writing a lot of novels about this idea of ghetto life and kind of black poverty. So he gets drunk one night and decides he's going to write something like that too, as a kind of satire. And then it becomes #1 on the bestseller list. And so suddenly he, based on the advice from his publisher, has to pretend that this is his actual story and assume a totally different life than the one he actually has. And hilarity and brilliant social satire ensue. But one of the most remarkable things about the movie is what I just described to you and what you saw in the trailer is actually only half the movie. The other half of the movie is about what he's actually facing in his personal life, the kind of troubles he has in his real life. And these are things that people from all races and all socioeconomic classes, these are the kind of troubles we all have. Things like loss in your life, grief, the difficulties of caring for an aging parent, supporting a loved one as they come to terms with their sexuality, and learning to love yourself fully. And these themes actually make up about half the movie. But I think this was actually really kind of brilliant, or really, I don't know, it was a very interesting move. None of that was in the marketing for the movie, which makes it kind of like what the story is telling you, that we have these ideas about people. So we see like, oh, okay, this is totally about racism and racial stereotypes, that's all it is. But once you're watching it, it actually has all this depth, and all these other things have nothing to do with racism that any of us can experience. But that's kind of left out of it, because that's not what we see, and maybe that's not what we're looking for, because we have this preconceived idea of other people being different than us. The Gospel of Matthew tells us, do not judge, so you may not be judged. For the judgment you give will be the judgment you get, and the measure you give will be the measure you get. And then it talks about this idea that we have a log in our own eye, something that's keeping us from seeing others. So I love that image of it being in our eye, because it's blocking us from seeing this huge thing. I mean, I wear contact lenses. Even having an eyelash in my eye is excruciating. But it's like we have a log in our eye that blocks us from seeing. But then we see that other people, they might have something small, and then we hyper-focus on them and wanting to change them and wanting to fix them, and we ignore what we have and all the judgments and all the things we're bringing to the table. So the movie and this idea reminds me of this brilliant TED Talk from 2009 by the Nigerian author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. She's written many books. She's really amazing. She wrote Americana, Half of a Yellow Sun, We Should All Be Feminists, and several other books. And the whole purpose of her TED Talk, it's called The Danger of a Single Story, is the same idea. And in it, she talks about growing up in Nigeria to sort of upper middle class in Nigeria. English is her first language, and then coming to school in America, and how her white roommate in college, when she first met her, she said, oh, teach me your tribal music. So she plays Mariah Carey, because that's what she listens to. And she says, well, what was it like? How did you learn English? Did you live in a hut? Like what, her roommate has these kind of ideas of what it means for her to be from Nigeria. And then she starts writing. She's studying English, and she has a literature professor, and he's a white upper-class man. And he complains that her stuff is not authentically African, as he puts it. And she says, well, what does that mean? I don't know, I'm African and I'm writing it. Doesn't that mean it's African? Kind of like this, I'm black and it's my book, therefore it's a black book. What do you mean? What's your idea of this? And the professor says, well, no, the problem, is your characters are too much like me. an educated upper middle class man. They drive cars. They're not starving. Therefore, they're not authentically African. This is from a college professor of, I assume, a good school. She's very, very smart, so I assume this is a good school. And she says, but the problem is this is how we create a single story. We show a people as one thing and only one thing over and over and over again. And then that's what they become. So we have one idea. So for her, the people around her, the white people around her in the States, were so used to the idea of Africans as fitting kind of one stereotype. So anyone who didn't, they'd say, oh, well, it's because you're not African. And it's the same in this movie. So he comes from an upper middle class background. He's very, very educated. His family, they have help that they pay. But that's not black enough, because that's not what the rest of us have as an idea of what blackness means. And she says the problem with a single story is it creates stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is not that they're untrue, but they're incomplete. They make one story the only story. So it makes me wonder, what are the one stories we have about other people? So when I would work in the Middle East, as I've mentioned many, many times, I'd meet with lots of different Israelis and lots of different Palestinians from all different backgrounds. And some of the people we'd meet with are peacemakers who've devoted their life to working with people from the other side, who are these really heroic, astounding people. Honestly, the best people I've ever met in my life. And they're both Israeli and Palestinian who are doing this. And then we'd meet other people who were in the military or who were in prison for committing violent crimes, or who were just kids, or all these different backgrounds. And then I'd come home and I'd give talks about it, and people would say, well, what are the Israelis like? I've heard the Israelis are like this. Or what are the Palestinians like? I think they're like this, right? And I'm like, gosh, what does that even mean? What does that mean? What are they like? What are all of us like here? So all of us, okay, so we all go to this church. We may not all be Christian, although most of us are Christian here. And we go to this church. We live in Vancouver. It's like, and I know this to be true because I'm also from the States. It's like when Americans come and they're like, oh, but you're being rude right now, but I thought all Canadians were nice. I'm like, really? I don't know. We have these ideas, right? And there's a social psychology idea. It sounds very complicated, but it makes a lot of sense. It's called in-group heterogeneity versus out-group homogeneity bias. And it means, so that sounds really complicated, but I can quickly break it down. So it's the idea that the people in your in-group, you know that we're different. So those of us here in this room, we know our differences. We've gotten to know each other a bit over time. Maybe this is our first time and we have no idea. Maybe you think we're all nice. I don't know, I hate to break it to you. Maybe we're not always nice all the time. But the people we're around, we're with them all the time. So we know that we're not exactly the same. So even if we all go to this church, even if we're all from Vancouver, even if we all come from one particular background, we know that there's a wide diversity, wide range of experiences and personalities and backgrounds and trauma and occupations and sexualities and identities in that group. But then we don't know people from other groups. And our brain likes to simplify things and likes to make patterns. So we make a lot of assumptions about other groups. So we say, oh, okay. Oh, so you're from Halifax, so you're going to be like this. Or you're from Nigeria, so you're going to be like this. Or you're a Republican, or you're a Palestinian, so you're going to be like this. And we assume we know everything about the person. And then we do this really insidious thing, where then if they start acting in a way that doesn't fit with what we assume, we try to explain it to ourselves. We have this kind of cognitive dissonance. So we're like, oh, well, okay, I guess that's not true for you, but maybe you're one of the good ones. Or maybe, what is your background? Like, where are you really from? Like, hold on, let me try to make sense of this. Because we want things to fit our patterns, because that's how our brain works. If our brain is always taking in endlessly complex things, that's exhausting. I find life exhausting anyway. I can't imagine if I weren't trying to make patterns in some way. So making a pattern isn't a bad thing. Chimamanda Ngozi, she says, stereotypes, there is a way that they make sense. It's not that they're based on nothing at all. But then when we reduce people to that, when it's just like, okay, that's what I know about you, so I'm going to make those assumptions. My husband is from India and is Muslim, and I remember when I called to tell my aunt who'd never met him that I was marrying a Muslim man, she said, but if you marry a Muslim man, you're not going to be allowed to drive. Making lots of assumptions. I actually do most of the driving. Samir hates driving. It's for jokes on her. And then even a few years into the relationship, I was complaining to a white friend who had a white partner about chores in the house. And I know none of you in this room have ever complained about your partner and chores. I know that's never come up at all. But I was kind of complaining about it, and she's like, oh, I bet he's not doing those chores because he's Muslim. He's a Muslim man. That's interesting. So I asked her, so does your white Christian man partner help you with these things? No, he doesn't. Oh, that's interesting. That's very interesting. So if Samir isn't cooking, it's because he's a Muslim man. But if your white Christian husband isn't helping, it's for some other reason, because there's complexity in your own tradition, but not in other people's traditions. So everyone else is just the same, right? So that's how we see each other. And of course, it's easy to kind of point out the hypocrisy in other people. You know, part of what's so hilarious in the movie is you see the white people who are saying and acting in these ridiculous ways. And it's so easy to kind of laugh at them, be like, oh, I would never be like that. I'm so much more advanced than that. But we're not, right? We all do these things. I remember when Samir and I went to Ecuador, and I was so impressed. The bus system was way more like streamlined and so nice and made way more sense than the bus system in Seattle. At the time, the roads there weren't any potholes in them, and I was thinking, oh my gosh, I wonder what I was thinking when I was coming to Ecuador. I had all these preconceived notions of, okay, I'm going to a country in South America, it's gonna be like this, and then it's way nicer than what I'm used to. So what are the ideas that I kind of have? And that's part of what's so beautiful as we travel, right, as we meet other people. I feel like nowadays we actually have less excuse than ever to kind of make these single story judgments about each other. Because it's in many ways easier to travel now than it has been. Even if you can't leave your house, you can go online, you can watch any kind of movies now, movies from all sorts of backgrounds. You can read books, but written by people from all sorts of backgrounds. We can actually take in lots and lots of different experiences. I remember a few years ago when a lot of white people started talking about anti-racism after the murder of George Floyd. One of the best pieces of advice I read in The Root from someone who's black said that, you know what, white people, you want to know what we think rather than interrogating all of us. Why don't you just start following social media accounts written by BIPOC people from other races, and don't say anything. Don't start following them and start arguing with them, or start writing and explaining how you're not like these other white people that they might be talking about. But just follow them and start taking it in. Start taking in more stories. The more we can do that and just show up for each other and listen. And I think a lot of it is just this emotional regulation. When we find out, like, oh, wait, that person is giving a story that's different than what I expected, rather than getting defensive about it, rather than trying to re-explain why our original idea is correct, or why we ourselves could never be racist, or going the opposite direction where then we're over-apologizing. And in so doing, we're centering ourselves again and making it all about us and our perceptions. How about we listen? How about we stop expecting ourselves to know everything and just listen to other people and drop some of our egos and take it in? And I think that's really our hope. That's hopefully what we can work on in this. I saw this really great analogy a couple years ago. They said racism is a lot like being in a leaky boat that's just filling up with water. And it doesn't fill up with water because we actively put the water in the boat, but it's leaky. So around us, we just have all the stereotypes that are already around us, all the ideas that kind of permeate things. So what we have to do is slowly bail out the boat. And I think we can best do that by making time for each other, listening to each other, purposely trying to befriend people who are different than us, and then listening to them and not talking over them. And I think if we do this slowly, we can work on this. So that hopefully in another generation or two, you try to show that trailer to your grandchildren, and they won't have any idea what it's about. It won't make any sense. But unfortunately, what we see now, that really rings true. It's the same as the TED Talk from like 15 years ago. That's still such a problem. So I think if we just try to be with each other, we can get past this and stop holding each other in such a negative light and maintaining such stereotypes. And finally, it's always a good idea to end a sermon with James Baldwin. Just if you're ever giving a sermon, that's a good tip. You'll never go wrong, truly. And James Baldwin reminds us that each of us, helplessly and forever, contains the other. Male and female, female and male, white and black and white. We're a part of each other. Many of my countrymen appear to find this fact exceedingly inconvenient and even unfair, and so very often do I, but we can't do anything about it. So instead, why don't we understand that we really do have more in common with each other than not, and do what we can to start listening to one another. Amen.